Hello, and welcome to SAS 620 Spiritual Social Action. This is the second video lecture I'll be posting for you to watch. In this present lecture here at Unity Institute and Seminary, we'll be treating essentially the early church. Not just the early church in general, but in particular, we'll be discussing early church structure and purpose, and particularly we'll be honing in on the charity work of the early church and the spread of this work in the early years of Christianity. Because Christianity has been and continues to be the moral, spiritual foundation on which the Western world has been built, and so has influenced the thought and the practice socioculturally throughout the Western world and beyond, even, yes, here in Unity and in New Thought circles. And the idea in the West is that individuals, organizations, and the state should offer help to those in need without any expectation for favor to be returned. That's largely due to Christianity's influence, because it didn't really exist before that. This Christian concept of charity was unique when it developed because it promoted the idea that it wasn't limited to one's own kith and kin. It wasn't limited to one's own family or household or even one's own sort of subcultural group. From the very founding of Christianity onward into the modern age today, or the postmodern age, Christians have carried with them this beneficial concept and practice of charity that has had a substantive impact on humanity in general. And so this is what I'm interested in discussing for the next, hopefully less than an hour. But this word charity arises from a Latin term called caritas. Caritas. It can mean costliness, meaning something of great value, and the esteem or the affection which you give that costliness. In fact, in the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible, caritas is often the word that's used to translate the Greek term agape, which means love. And not just any kind of love, as many of you probably know, but agape is really reserved out of all the terms for love, for that kind of love that is selfless, that looks to regard for others, maybe even at the expense of oneself. It could be seen as a type of self-sacrificial love, or a love that doesn't ask for anything in return from its fellow human beings. And at this point, this is where we can begin to connect charity to spiritual social action. Charity might be seen, I would argue, as the spiritual emotional quality or element that is found in just social action in general. It's sort of the faith drive behind peace and justice work. It's a way of talking about that faith, that spiritual component in action. Now, there was, of course, a precedent for charity work, social action work, in the Hebrew tradition, within the community of the Israelites, within Judaism, we might say. If we go way back to the Hebrew Bible, when it was first written, I'm particularly thinking of the Torah, in Levitical law, and even more specifically in the Torah. It instructs, for instance, landowners. There's an instruction specifically for landowners to allow the poor to glean food from their fields, to leave a portion of it for gleaning, for the poor to have for themselves, to take as they need. And the first century Jews were known, even in the pagan world, for this practice of almsgiving, so giving to the poor. But Jewish customs prevented the widespread influence that Christianity would ultimately have, because it Judaism at that time, from the ancient centuries BCE into the first centuries CE, at that time it didn't really have the widespread influence that Christianity came to have. It didn't have the success as a missionary, a universalistic kind of religion that Christianity eventually became. So let's turn our attention specifically to the early church. And let's talk about the structure of the early church first, because believe it or not, this is an important piece to understanding how the early church went about doing what it did. Let's start with Paul. Paul's the earliest writer in the New Testament, the earliest prominent figure within Christianity in general. In his letters, in his talks about leadership and church organization, it all centers on what he calls charisma, or charismatic gifts of the Spirit, you might say. Gifts of teaching and preaching and pastoral care. The gifts of speaking in tongues and interpreting those tongues. Prophesying. All of these, the list goes on and on, but these are considered by Paul spiritual gifts that are to be cultivated within the body of Christ. And the body of Christ is Paul's mystical metaphor, a mystical symbol for the many gifts that people in the church have, even though they're all grounded in and are inspired by one Spirit, one God. The earliest church groups, I'm thinking of in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 2, they all were praying together. They had table fellowship together. And they, quote, shared everything in common, giving to people according to their needs. What we see here is a practice within the church, a kind of redistribution of community resources for the common good, for the good of everyone, every individual, not just certain people, not according to who has earned it or who hasn't earned it, but it says specifically, giving to people according to their needs. Now, those are the earliest structures, the earliest structure of the church, and in doing what it did, in doing the charity work that it was cultivating, it was all based on spiritual gifts. It was what I call the charismatic period of the church. But eventually, a small group of people who were educated and who were highly trained in Christian faith and teaching and practice, very early on, we're still talking about the New Testament period, they would elect a group of elders called presbyteroi. And presbyteroi, which is plural, meaning presbyters, you might say. That's where the word Presbyterian comes from. But this group of people sort of arose as leaders. Their duties were teaching, preaching, governing, administrating, providing the sacraments, and were in charge of the liturgy in the local congregation. Let's not forget that word liturgy, liturgia, means the work of the people. So they were leading the work of the people. They weren't doing it for the people. They were with the people, leading it. Okay, that's a huge, important distinction, because I think that gets misunderstood today. But the name priest comes from this word presbyteros. Presbyteros turns into what we would call the priesthood. Eventually, each church community chooses or elects one or two elders who were then named priests. Okay, and now in the beginning of Acts chapter 6, we see a new office arise. Before that, this office didn't exist, but the elders were having trouble actually maintaining all of their duties, all the many pastoral, teaching, administrative duties that they were in charge of. And so the community designates a group of people to be sort of the assistants to the priests and the elders. And they became responsible for teaching, but also administering certain church tasks, of course. This group of people were called the diakonoi, or individually or singly they'd be called a diakonos, a deacon, right? Deacons, or a deacon. And what their special purpose was to, they were in charge of charity work. They're in charge of social action. They're in charge of the distribution of food to those who had need, visiting people in prisons, caring for the sick, providing safeguards for orphans and widows, etc. That was the sole ministerial duty within the church, early church community, of deacons. So we have elders, we have deacons, and then a little bit later on, we see the office of bishop arise. And the word that we get bishop from is episkopoi, which is plural, so bishops. But a singular bishop would be an episkopos. And this literally means an overseer, someone who oversees a group of churches. Eventually, as the church grows, as people realize that Christianity as an institution must have some kind of administrative structure in order for it to sustain itself and continue its work into the future, it must have something like this in place. Eventually, the office of bishop developed out of that need. Okay, the word episkopos, like I said, means overseer, and that's what they did. Just like today, in more Episcopal style polity churches, like the Catholic Church, like the Greek Orthodox churches, or the Eastern Orthodox churches in general, the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Anglican Communion, most, I should say, Lutheran churches function this way with bishops and things, and that's what they do. They take care of, or they oversee multiple congregations within a particular region, okay? And they are also in charge of appointing people to certain offices. They would be in charge of ordaining and correcting priests and deacons within their domain. I think it's important for me to point out that these people weren't, by and large, power-hungry dictators or something like that. They were often elected among the elders. They weren't, this office grew out of a necessity, like I said, a kind of administrative leaders who needed to really lead the church as an organization if it was going to survive, especially at how quickly it was growing across the empire. It's really no different than today. As a group or as a business or as an organization or company grows to a certain size, it needs to expand, right? And when you expand, you hire skillful administrators like CEOs or CFOs or others to more efficiently and effectively govern the enterprise. So bishops ultimately evolve out of that need. But in the apostolic age, so we're talking 1st, 2nd century CE, the terms for these offices were still somewhat fluid. They weren't fixed quite yet. Sometimes a term would be used in a technical sense, as the title for an office, and sometimes it wouldn't be. So in the apostolic age, sometimes Paul, for instance, would describe himself as a diakonos, right, a servant or a minister, a deacon. Even though he held an office much higher than that of a deacon, he was an apostle, and that's certainly sort of would have been considered as more authoritative than a deacon. But, on another occasion, Peter will describe himself as a fellow elder, a fellow presbyteros, even though he, as an apostle, again, has a higher office than that of just an ordinary elder, presbyter. The term for bishop, though, episkopos, was also pretty fluid in meaning too. Sometimes it designated an overseer of a particular individual congregation. Other times, but more often, it would have been used to talk about someone who oversees a whole city or a whole region of churches. Sometimes it would just be the person named as the highest ranking clergy person in a local church. So it was very fluid. Although the terms bishop and priest and deacon were fluid in the apostolic age, by the middle of the 2nd century, they had achieved that fixed understanding that they're used today to designate these 3 offices that we see in the earliest of Christianity. But the point here is, what I'm trying to convey is that this rigid hierarchical structure didn't develop in the church until well into the 2nd century. And even then, it really wasn't formed out of some sinister plan of domination or something like that, taking over Western civilization. By no means at all. It developed very much like any other group or organization would over time. If they're going to be successful, if they're going to grow themselves, you need some type of a structure, some order to delegate didactic, homiletical, liturgical, ecclesial, charitable work within the Church of Jesus the Christ. And that's what they saw themselves doing. These offices provided, particularly the office of deacon, the diaconate, really drove home the importance of charity work and social action within the early church. So Christian attitudes, of course, towards charity, they're grounded in the teachings and the person of Jesus Christ. Most of his sayings and teachings emphasize this role of caring for the poor, the outcast, and the downtrodden of society, radically declaring their liberation, their wholeness, their place as fully included and blessed and beloved children of God in the kingdom of God. From the most widely used of all the Gospels in the early church, Matthew, we see this prominent passage, Matthew 25:35 through 40, where Jesus speaks of physical, material care for, quote, the least of these in our society. Not as an option, not as a possibility, not as optional doing or something like that, but as a requirement, something that you must do if you're going to consider yourself to be a follower of Jesus the Christ. If you want to be a disciple, if you want to follow the way shower, then these acts are central to the gospel that Jesus proclaims: feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, giving drink to those who are thirsty, hospitality to the stranger, giving resources to the poor, visiting the sick and the imprisoned where they are in their time of need. He says, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. Jesus is identifying himself with the poor, with those in need, with the disadvantaged and marginalized of society, those people who have been sort of squeezed out as human junk. Those are the people Jesus attends to. If you express God's love, if you want to follow me, Jesus says, then you do this by caring for those downtrodden people of society. You meet their most basic physical and emotional needs. You include them. You do for them. You serve them. There are lots of instances where Jesus does this, expresses God's love and compassion for the poor. In Matthew 19:21, Jesus says, if you wish to be complete, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And come follow me. Again, following Jesus is directly linked to caring for the poor and living a kind of humble existence. It's well known that the Gospel of Luke emphasizes social action and justice and peacemaking concerns. Think of Luke 14, verses 13 and 14. He says, but when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. You will be blessed, since they don't have the means to repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And in Luke 19, 8 through 9, Jesus says, and Zacchaeus, this is the Zacchaeus story. Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today, meaning right now, salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. Now, the most significant of all these stories is probably the Good Samaritan, right? The context of the story is often overlooked, though, because Jesus had instructed the people to love their neighbors as themselves. It comes right after the question about who is my neighbor. But in Jesus' time, social responsibility was limited to members of one's own family, one's own household, or one's own kith and kin. So when asked, who is your neighbor, who is actually a neighbor, Jesus took the opportunity to radically expand the boundaries of who is considered one's neighbor, the scope of one's obligations. By using the example of a Jewish person helping a Samaritan, who Jesus' Jewish audience saw as religious and cultural enemies, the hero here is a Samaritan. That's the point. Jesus imposed the burden of charity on people in this way, and mercy towards those who aren't a part of one's own religion or caste or class or gender or any of those things. Jesus was about breaking down those socio-cultural barriers to people that would somehow impede the free flow of care and compassion and love. So the point here is that you should help those who are in need, those who need help, regardless of what their social class is or what kind of kinship you may or may not have with them. This is probably early Christianity's most important expansion of the Jewish concept of charity. It's expanding it beyond, kith and kin. I do want to mention the Epistle of James before I go outside the New Testament, because there's something so important of the letter of James. The letter of James, I think Martin Luther wanted to sort of kick out of the New Testament altogether, because it focused so much on doing things as works and action and conduct as being part and parcel of what salvation means, not simply faith alone. James 1:27 says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress. That's the highest height of religion for whoever was writing James. That's the most pure and undefiled religion, is caring for orphans and widows. That's huge. That's a huge statement. In James chapter 2, 15 and 16, if a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, yet you don't give to them what's necessary for their body, what use is that? The letter of James was a very important piece of the canon early on. But examples of Christian charity in the early church don't end with the New Testament. Christians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries also wrote about this because they were doing it. There's a text called the Didache, probably written around the year 100 CE, a little bit after the Gospel of John. It's a kind of instruction manual for recent converts, people who are going through the catechesis process, teaching them into the faith. It instructed Christians to give to everyone who asks of you. Don't ever refuse. This is part of the teaching, the official catechetical teaching that we find in the Didache. Similarly, in a very popular work that was widely circulated in the early 2nd century, the Shepherd of Hermas. The Shepherd of Hermas instructed Christians to, quote, give simply to all without asking doubtfully to whom you give, but give to all, end quote. So in the early 200s, church leader Tertullian, he was a very prominent author and speaker and writer, and a very pious man, reports that Christians had a voluntary common fund that people would deposit what they could as a common fund. And the common fund was then used to support widows, the disabled, orphans, the sick, the elderly, shipwrecked sailors, he says, prisoners, teachers, burial of the dead for people who couldn't afford to bury their loved ones. They even had a fund specifically for the release of slaves, because slavery, again, had little or nothing to do with your ethnicity or your race. It had everything to do with economics, your socioeconomic situation. Anyone could become a slave in that day and age. If you owed someone a lot of money that you couldn't pay back, you're their slave for a certain period of time until you can work that off. So a lot of the fund was being put towards, in a lot of Christian congregations, was being put towards relieving people of their debt so that they could become free. You see, so as early as the 2nd century, Christians were practicing a kind of interesting and very sacrificial, you might even say, form of charity. They would fast from meals so that the unconsumed food and resources could be given to the poor and the hungry. So they were literally fasting, not just for spiritual purposes, but so that when they would skip a meal, that meal could be used to feed someone in their stead. In The Shepherd of Hermas, we have a quote in chapter 3. Having fulfilled, quote, what is written, in the day on which you fast, you will taste nothing but bread and water. And having reckoned up the price of the dishes of that day which you intend to have eaten, you will give it to a widow, or an orphan, or to some person in want. And thus you will exhibit humility of mind, so that he who has received benefit from your humility may fill his own soul and pray for you to the Lord. We also see this in another 2nd century writing, the Apology of Aristides, written around the year 130. It's a Christian writing. Quote, and if there is among them any that is poor and needy, and if they have no spare food, they fast 2 or 3 days in order to supply to the needy their lack of food. So people were fasting not just for spiritual reasons, but for very physical, material, charitable reasons as well. And this practice was quite enduring. Even Origen, Bishop Origen, and head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, in Egypt, he writes in the 3rd century, let the poor man be provided with food from the self-denial of him who fasts. I think that actually captures it quite well right there. Many historians who I've read have calculated that at Rome in around the year 250 CE, under Pope Cornelius, about 10,000 Christians who had vowed to fast from their food for spiritual reasons or for charitable reasons could provide, from about 100 days of fasting, 1 million rations a year. 1 million rations a year. So these were regular offerings, and they were supplemented by gifts made to the church by wealthy patrons who were converts to Christianity, but who had lots and lots of money and probably status. It was in their homes the early church probably met, and it was their resources that the church often used, in addition to this fasting practice I'm talking about. So the point is that the early church devoted a bunch of time and energy and resources to charitable giving and social action like this. But uniquely, the Christians didn't limit their giving to just their own subculture or as an exchange of favors, which is the way that most of society and culture around them did. To cities filled with the homeless and the impoverished all around them, Christianity offered of course, charity, as well as hope in the life to come. In Christian homes, it was pretty common, just a cursory glance of history and reading what was going on in Christian homes during this time period, it wasn't uncommon for whole homes, whole families, whole households to adopt a style of life that would have been modeled on the early apostles. Some devoted themselves to missionary works, others to charitable deeds among the outcasts of Roman society, like lepers, other people identified as unclean or impure, vagabonds, prostitutes, the homeless and destitute, you name it. Christian households oftentimes would have been dedicated to this, in addition to whole Christian communities and churches. Churches everywhere around the empire were taking care of widows and orphans. They were tending to the sick and the infirm and the disabled. Again, burying the dead, caring for slaves, furnishing work, coming up with jobs sometimes for people who needed it. The list goes on and on. This broad approach to charity and social action simply didn't exist before Christianity really came on the scene. Now, I invite you to kind of reflect on that fact for just a little while. Without Jesus Christ, without the work of the early church, the whole notion of charity probably wouldn't have existed or have been cultivated in Western society. That's a huge deal. Now, the predominant concept of charity, if we want to call it that, at the time in Greco-Roman society was not really what I've been talking about so far. The predominant concept of charity had more to do with sort of an exchange of favors, akin to the patron-client relationship that existed. There were no religious organizations dedicated to hunger relief or poverty relief. There were no social safety nets like we have today. Think Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, other social services that are funded publicly. Those things simply didn't exist. Pliny the Younger, who was a prominent official living in the 1st century CE, not a Christian, even wondered if charities that gave to the poor should be allowed to exist. In the Greco-Roman world, this was a very real question. Plato, even, we're talking Plato, like the main philosopher of a few hundred centuries BCE, he says, and I quote from the Republic, "A poor man who was no longer able to work because of sickness should be left to die." That's Plato speaking there. That might give you a different conception of Plato than what you might have had before now. The Roman philosopher Plautus stated, "You do a beggar bad service by giving him food and drink. You lose what you give and prolong his life for misery." See the logic being used there? All in all, I could give a whole bunch of instances of Greco-Roman philosophers or householders or letter writers saying similar things. Greco-Roman society regarded mercy and compassion as sort of pathological in a way. Pathological, they're almost like pathological emotions that are distracting, and they're almost like defects in your character to be avoided by all rational people. If you're a reasonable, rational person, you don't care and have compassion and empathy for people like that. Mercy and compassion involves providing unearned help or relief. And by and large, in Greco-Roman society, that was seen as contrary to justice, antithetical to equality and justice, regardless of the socioeconomic system of oppression that was, most definitely in place and benefiting the 1 or 2% of haves and the 98% some have-nots. It was quite a detriment to those 98% of people. Now, the difference between pagans, and I use the word pagan just meaning Greco-Roman people who weren't Jewish or Christian. It's just a general word. I don't mean it pejoratively in any way. But the difference between Greco-Roman pagans and Christians on the practice of charity was even recognized by Greco-Roman writers at the time. There are pagans or Greco-Roman writers sort of condemning Christianity for this kind of work. For example, the satirist Lucian, around the year writing between 130 and 200, mocked Christians for this work. He says, and I quote, "The earnestness with which the people of this religion help one another in their needs is incredible. They spare themselves nothing for this end. Their first lawgiver put it into their heads that they were all brothers." Meaning, you're not really brothers, so why are you doing this stuff? Even more interestingly, the Emperor Julian, who attempted to lead the Roman Empire sort of back into traditional Greco-Roman religion after the influence of Christianity came on the scene, he became really frustrated by the sort of moral rectitude of Christians, especially when it came to charity. And this was something that he readily admitted. He says, quote, "The impious Galileans relieve both their own poor and ours. It's shameful that ours should be so destitute of our own assistance." So he's like, the Christians are taking care of people, what the heck, you know. And so he tries to emulate the Christian church, Julian does. And he attempted to impose a high sense of moral behavior on his priests. And he attempted to copy, actually, aspects of Christian charity. In fact, you can read about this in some of his letters. In one epistle, in one of the epistles of Julian, they're called, he gives instructions to his high priest in Galatia to establish a number of inns, or we might call them like hostels or something like that, in each village, so that strangers who are passing through could have a place to stay when they needed it. You know, that kind of thing. It seems that Greco-Roman recognition of Christian charitable efforts was a pretty significant factor in the conversion of people to Christianity. And I argue elsewhere, but I'm going to argue it here, and this is supported by most historians of the early church, that this is one of the central reasons why Christianity grew so fast. It grew so fast because of charity work. It went from a fledgling group of like country bumpkins in the outskirts of the empire to the official religion of the Roman Empire in just like 275 years. That's crazy. That's a huge a huge transformation that happened, and it was largely because the church demonstrated the love of Jesus Christ by caring for the poor, the widows, and the orphans, by giving alms and support like the synagogue communities did before them. I might call it an agapeic love, an agape kind of love. This kind of self-sacrificial love that asks for nothing in return was the guiding principle in all of this. And it has been minimized in some circles as a reason for turning to the church. Well, the early Christians, that brotherly love for all stuff, that couldn't have really been what converted everyone. But that's simply not the case. It was highly and widely recognized as one of the primary reasons why people came into the church. It started as, meeting their needs, meeting people's needs. That's where it started. Caring for those in society who no one else would care for. But then those people began asking questions like, well, why are you doing all of this? What's the reason why you're doing this and no one else is doing it? Where do these acts of charity and kindness and compassion flow from? Whence? And then they were told, of course, the story of Jesus Christ. And then they made the connection. Now, as the church develops into the Middle Ages, and beyond into the modern world, this central practice of charity was able to make inroads into every part of the culture. Eventually it did, because Christianity became sort of, as Rome crumbled, it became the only structure that could sustain that part of the world at the time, socially, politically, and religiously. Even when the church became powerful and at times quite corrupt with that authority, there were always groups of priests, monks, monasteries, nuns, and convents leading the way in offering this charity work and social action in local villages, in local towns, in provinces and regions all over Europe. Now, this Christian ethic of charity continues strongly into modern times, even to today. Let's just take North America. In North America alone, there are almost 800 Protestant missions presently, and they receive and dispense over $2 billion annually to those who are in need. Christian churches support over 500 religious rescue missions in urban areas across North America. Organizations like the Salvation Army, the Catholic Social Services, Lutheran Social Services, the Pew Charitable Trust, the YMCA, the YWCA, even the Red Cross and the United Way, all have very explicit Christian origins, and they tend to maintain that Christian identity, with the exception of both the United Way and the Red Cross, which are now secular organizations, but their origins and their early grounding were in Christian faith. There's no doubt about that. But the modern link between Christianity and charity isn't really limited to the creation of large and successful charitable organizations, even though we could make a long list of them. It produces charitable individuals as well, and that's super important. Recent Gallup polls reveal the widespread factor of Christianity and religion in charitable giving. It seems like poll after poll, study after study I read, from the Pew Forum to the Public Religion Research Institute and everything in between, it's clear that churches and synagogues contribute to America's social service and charity work more than any other non-governmental organization or institution, including corporations. And according to some recent studies I've been consulting in the UK and the US, religious institutions in general across the board, not just Christianity, but across the board, do more charity work than secular organizations do, including governments. Also, I've been looking recently into an extensive study done by the National Study of American Jewish Giving and the National Study of American Religious Giving, called jointly Connected to Give. This study reveals that religious individuals, those who say they attend some religious service regularly, more than once a month, are more likely to not only donate a higher percentage of their household income to charitable causes, but we're also more likely to be more generous with their time and resources by doing social action and going out and doing charity work than people who don't consider themselves religious. And this is actually corroborated by source after source, research after research that I come into. So, as I wrap this up, where Christianity spread, wherever it spread, it carried with it the teaching that charity work, spiritual social action, another name for it today, was a religious duty. It should be broadly given, not just to certain people who are like you, but it's part and parcel of the gospel of Jesus and about Jesus. So when Christianity rose to prominence in the Roman Empire, new charitable programs were instituted. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christianity promoted widespread charity to those who are in need. Even in our modern day, the great charitable organizations in the West were founded upon this Christian ethic. And modern day polls today show that Christianity plays a very significant role in providing charitable giving and services. So I guess what I'm saying, my takeaway from all of this isn't simply to say, yay, Christianity. It's not that exactly, but it's saying that part and parcel of Christian identity and faith and practice, part and parcel of the gospel of Jesus Christ, is charity. It's this great contribution to humanity. It's absolutely central to what it means to be a true follower of Jesus the Christ, is to engage, to let the love of God fill your heart, and then from there to take that out into the world in terms of charity and spiritual social action. Spiritual social action and justice and peacemaking, these are all practices integral to the teaching of Jesus Christ and the good news, the good message, the gospel that Jesus was promoting. So that's what I think not only the teachings of Jesus, but Christian identity, belief, and practice is all about. And that should give us at least a little bit of foundation in sort of not just some of the biblical origins of this, but some of the ecclesial, church-oriented origins of charitable work and spiritual social action. So let's stop here for now. Grace and peace to you all.